I think he got a slap on the wrist. Now, I'm going to be sitting looking at it, and I hate going onto X because it's a dumpster fire, but I'm going to be going on Elon Musk account to see whether he acknowledges that he got the slap.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've spoken to Scott Lucas, a professor of American Studies at the Clinton Institute at the University of Dublin. He's spoken to us about international relations right now between the US, the UK and the EU. French President Emmanuel Macron stepping up, saying that he's considering letting the rest of the EU kind of share the nuclear weapons that they hold. We've spoken to him about Donald Trump potentially giving Elon Musk a slap on the wrist, telling him he can't fire staff anymore. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube. Scott Lucas, a professor of American Studies at the Clinton Institute, which is of course the University of Dublin. Thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Well, it's another busy week for us. We just mentioned that it's kind of impossible to go through absolutely everything that's coming out of the Trump administration and international relations, but we're going to try our best today. I'm going to start off with a new report from Politico. They're reporting that several of Trump's senior staff members have been holding secret meetings with Zelensky's political rivals. Can you kind of walk me through this update?
So as we've had this question about how far the Trump administration will go in breaking with Ukraine, including defending it against the Russian invasion, and how far the Trump administration might go in deciding with the Kremlin, this report comes out that I believe 4 administration officials have met with either Yulia Tymoshenko, who is former prime minister of Ukraine, or with senior members of the party of Petro Poroshenko, who is Vladimir Zelensky's immediate predecessor as president, 2014 to 2019. And when this report came out in Politico, and it has been confirmed by the camps of Tymoshenko and Poroshenko that they did have these meetings, suspicions were raised because the Russians are quite clearly calling for the replacement of Vladimir Zelensky as president, even before they'll enter into their so-called peace talks, negotiations. And the question was whether certain members of the Trump administration want to get rid of Zelensky as well. We know, for example, that Elon Musk has been demeaning him on X. We know that J.D. Vance has been insulting him. And of course, we know that Donald Trump has called him a dictator and says he has no support. Now, when the reports came out, the camps of Tymoshenko and Poroshenko immediately said, look, we talked to these people, the Trump administration, but it was not about replacing Zelensky. It was about the broader question of, will the U.S. continue to support Ukraine's security, which of course is in line with what Zelensky says is the priority. We don't know the reality of the talks. What I can do is I can add another layer to this, which is the context of this. Since the assault, the verbal assault, which I think was a planned ambush by J.D. Vance, and then I don't think it was planned by Donald Trump, but I think Donald Trump then joined in on the attempted humiliation of Zelensky. Since that has taken place, we've got this running narrative, which is of the very serious U.S. attempts or Trump administration attempts to break away from Ukraine, for example, by cutting off, suspending military aid, including the military aid that was in transit to Ukraine that had been authorized by the Biden administration, and then by this serious step of cutting intelligence sharing, which both limits Ukrainians' ability to attack Russian targets, and it exposes Ukraine to missile and drone attacks, including a very serious attack which occurred overnight. But there are some Trump officials who are continuing to talk to Zelensky's government. So on Tuesday, those Americans, and the only name that came out was Keith Kellogg, who's Trump's envoy to Ukraine, they spoke to Zelensky's camp and said, look, you've got to give us something to get Trump back on board. This was what led to or contributed to Zelensky's social media post. It was not a letter to Trump. It was a social media post which said, we're looking forward to working under the great leadership, the strong leadership of Donald Trump to get not only the raw minerals deal, but to get the security guarantees. And that's what Yeah, it is. And so it's like there's different factions in the Trump administration, which is that one faction that I think wants to be rid of Zelensky, and there's that one faction that actually says, no, we still need to support the Zelensky government. We don't need to walk away completely from Europe and Ukraine. And to break those factions down roughly, J.D. Vance, the Abandon Ukraine, Abandon Europe faction, he said it at the Munich Security Conference. Probably or possibly the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, but he's a minor character in all of this. More importantly, a group around Donald Trump Jr. And Donald Trump Jr. was on social media this week saying we should have economic links with Russia, not with Ukraine. So he's open about it. Stephen Miller, Trump's policy advisor, you've got all of them, and then you've got Keith Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine, possibly Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, who has been supportive of Ukraine in the past, and maybe, but it's a huge maybe, Marco Rubio, who just seems to be twisting in the wind as Secretary of State. There's a battle going on within the Trump administration, and what Europe and Ukraine are hoping is, can we get to the adults in the room where if we cannot get immediate U.S. support, at least we have that option open as Europe ramps up its own aid and security guarantees for the Ukrainians.
Absolutely. It does seem like it might be divisive within the Republican Party, whether or not we're seeing that in the public eye or not, Scott. But it's saying if we've seen Donald Trump and we've seen Elon Musk, we've seen J.D. Vance say that Ukraine needs to be holding an election, right? But they're currently under martial law. They're in the middle of a war. It wouldn't really make sense. But one of the things is, it's kind of like, how damaging would that even look on Donald Trump if he tried to enforce an election when he's A, taken away military aid to Ukraine, B, taken away intelligence sharing with Ukraine, but C, halted any cyber operation offensive against Russia. So I don't understand how that would be a fair election when Ukraine can't even hold up any sort of protection online or physically as well.
Yeah, well, let's start off with the immediate question of that that election, right, and the conditions for it. Let's ask your great viewers and your listeners in the UK, how many elections did the UK hold between 1939 and 1945 during World War II? And the answer, of course, would be 0. So, it's not the idea that it is normal in war that you follow an electoral cycle. That's not necessarily true. Let's accelerate it to 2025. Part of Ukraine is under occupation by Russia, more than 25%. How would those Ukrainians be able to vote freely and fairly when they effectively are under the control of a foreign entity? Many Ukrainians have had to flee the country. We're talking about several million. How do you arrange voting for them under wartime conditions? Other Ukrainians live close to the front line in Ukrainian territory, but those areas may not be safe for them to be able to carry out votes. And then in the rest of Ukraine, you have the problem that the Russians are interfering in elections throughout the world, but especially throughout the region, interfering in the Moldova election. They have interfered in the Romanian election through a Romanian party. I can explain that in a separate podcast. They have interfered in the processes in Belarus and in Georgia as well. So, the Russians would try to tilt this against Zelensky. So that's just the conditions. But let's bring out the effect of what has happened. I've got close Ukrainian contacts. And this week, and some of these contacts are not fans of Zelensky. There's a range of opinion on Ukraine and Zelensky. To a person, they have said they support Zelensky because of what happened by Trump and Vance attempting to humiliate him. There is, in other words, a perceived attack on Ukraine's nationalism and its national survival in terms of what happened. The latest poll, by the way, for what it's worth is that Zelensky has, if the election was to be held, he has more than 40% support. The nearest challenger, who's Valery Zaluzhny, former military commander-in-chief, current Ukrainian ambassador to the UK, has just over 20%. So he's 20 points behind. The two people that Trump's people spoke to, Tymoshenko and Poroshenko, Poroshenko's got about 5%. I think Tymoshenko's about 1.7%. So this idea that Zelensky is not popular, it's not that. But the broader point here is the one that you have made pretty well. It looks like Trump has issued an ultimatum to Ukraine. Not tried to work with Ukraine, not to try to cooperate, but issue an ultimatum to Ukraine at the same time that Russia is issuing its own ultimatum.
And a reporter I spoke to the other week, Scott, he was saying that a lot of Ukrainians believe we can criticize Zelensky. We can criticize Zelensky. The moment you, an outside source, an international politician, come for our leader, no, it's not happening.
Yeah, I think that's true of most countries, to be honest with you. But particularly a country which is trying to survive in a war. You know, what gives you the right to come in and lecture us about the way that we carry out our affairs? And let's be clear about what the Americans are lecturing. Now, they're not just lecturing Ukrainians about Vladimir Zelensky's future. They're lecturing Ukrainians about trying to hold on to their country. Because when they keep putting out that mantra of peace talks, or as I had it framed to me by another media outlet today, Donald Trump's war for peace, what Ukrainians hear is, you want us to accept the Russian terms, which are the long-term Russian occupation of our country, the lifting of sanctions on Russia, the denial of security for Ukraine, including any possible relationship with NATO or Western Europe, and possibly that we have to change our government. That's what they hear. And if you want to connect all of this, what started all of this off is that if you go back, and I'm sure you've watched it, but go back and rewatch that whole fiasco in the White House, most of that conversation is going okay. And then it gets triggered when J.D. Vance jumps in and says, President Biden is terrible. He's terrible. But President Trump, he's brilliant. He's brilliant for diplomacy. And what Vladimir Zelensky heard, what he heard him saying was not just that Vance is praising Trump, but he's telling Zelensky, you have to accept the U.S.-Russia direct talks. And that's why Zelensky says to J.D. Vance politely, can I respond? Can I say something? Vance says yes. And there's about 2 to 3 minutes that get clipped out of when this is replayed, where Zelensky is going back to the talks and the discussions, especially since 2014, when Russia seized part of Ukraine, including Crimea, and tried to split off the East, saying, we've had diplomacy, we tried to talk, they have walked away from talks, they have not upheld their end of the bargain, and they've continued killing us and taking our territory. That's when Vance jumped down his throat. And so what Zelensky was doing was that message that most Ukrainians are still holding on to, which is, we have differences about what we're doing, we have questions about how we conduct this war, but why are you lecturing us on what we should do when we are the ones being killed and the ones whose country is at risk?
And it's kind of interesting, actually, Scott, because the constituents that Donald Trump got on his side are the ones that were sick of being lectured themselves by the elite woke or the liberals that were telling them how to live their lives. So it's the exact same thing. But I want to move on to kind of international relations now. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron has signalled that he's prepared to use France's nuclear weapons to use as an umbrella over the rest of the EU. It's quite generous because right now in Europe, only the UK and France have nuclear weapons. The rest don't. So he says he will use it for everyone if they can't rely on the US to help in the event that there is an attack. Now, do you feel like Trump's kind of lack of allegiance to the EU and the UK have led them to do this?
Let me put that whole Emmanuel Macron nuclear umbrella play and several other proposals. Let me put this in just a wide context with a bit of a personal story. The meeting between Trump and Zelensky is on a Friday. So the European officials convene again in Brussels on the Monday after that. And I happen to be lucky that I know some of them. And my immediate thought was, look, is Europe just going to roll over and just like, we just can't carry this out now because we have to have the Americans on board. And what was interesting is the message I got back is, look, we can't fill the gap that the Americans are providing, but we're going to step this up. We are going to have to step this up. So let's talk about some other measures alongside with what you just mentioned, which is the Macron offer, which I think is largely symbolic. I'll explain why. Start with the fact that you have a 5-point plan laid out by Ursula von der Leyen as the European Commission head for an 800 billion euro investment in defense investment and production, using both public capital, freeing up governments to use state funds, and private investors. Combine that with the fact that Ukraine has a flourishing defense technology industry because of this invasion, especially in the West, which is why you're talking about troops to protect those facilities. We're talking about drone technology, for example. We're talking about technology in terms of cyber ops. We're talking about technology which does extend to ground operations as well. But we're also talking about a lot of technology useful in aerial operations. So there's a big potential there if you can connect all the Europeans up and if you can devote the resources to it. You just have to do this on an emergency basis. That's what you've been seeing this week. What you've also been seeing is, look, if we can't immediately get the Trump administration on board, what does a security guarantee for Ukraine look like? Now, part of this discussion will be, and Giorgia Meloni actually laid it out yesterday. I'm surprised more people didn't notice this, which is if Ukraine cannot join NATO in the near future, we give it an Article 5 commitment to defend it if it is attacked, right? So that idea of, especially if you get some type of ceasefire, if Russia attacks again, this time we're in, we're supporting. Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, has also mentioned this. So you've got that type of security guarantee in terms of, the whole question of the path to NATO, along with the practical arrangements, which is, can we put the troops in? Can we give the troops air cover? And Keir Starmer has hinted. You notice that when he talks about Britain supporting Ukraine, where he's talked about troops and where he's talked about also planes in the air, that's what he's referring to. But again, the big issue is France, the UK, other Europeans have less planes than the Americans have. You would rather have the Americans do it, but what do you do in the alternative? The Macron nuclear umbrella, that's especially important that he puts that out there for the countries in Eastern Europe. Baltic states, Poland, who are the countries that are on the front, that next wave of countries that Putin could try to destabilize and possibly attack. So all of this is being combined with, and then another element, which is to get an alternative path to negotiations, which means that the direct U.S.-Russia negotiations do not set the agenda. And that's why the idea was floated that Macron, Starmer, and Zelensky could go to see Trump in Washington. Now, I think that was floated in just to see what the reaction is. The reality here is that the Ukrainians are going to meet the Americans next Tuesday in Saudi Arabia. So we now have direct U.S.-Ukraine talks. How those talks go, we don't know. But we also know that Zelensky's going out to Saudi Arabia to meet the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. The attempt here is to get the diplomatic initiative so you are not presented with a Russian ultimatum through the Americans.
What I wonder about, Scott, is because we've obviously got the EU with the UK really stepping up to help out. And you know what? Regardless of the outcome, regardless of the frazzled relationships right now with the US, this is the good thing to come out of this, because the EU and the UK, they needed to step up regardless. They should have done it years, decades ago, because you can't be relying so much on the US. But of course, no one could have predicted that this would happen, especially it takes 6 weeks for this to happen in Trump's presidency. But one of the things that I've spoken to about with numerous people on the show, but mostly Sir Bill Browder, who is a huge advocate for the EU confiscating this $300 billion worth of Russian assets and in turn putting it back into the hands of Ukraine. The problem is, though, how do you do that without severing more ties with the US? Is the way in which they do that, Scott, confiscating the $300 billion, going to Trump saying, hey, we're going to use this money to buy US weapons, therefore putting more money into the US, and then give it to Ukraine for protection?
Yeah, I think the problem, as I understand it, and I'm reaching back into an economics degree from long ago, is that to just simply seize that $300 billion in assets, which sits in various countries' financial systems, is destabilizing to the financial system to pull all of those out just at one go. So what the play here is by many countries is, look, we've got the assets frozen. We're going to accrue profits off of those assets, use the profits to support Ukraine, right? And people will say, well, that may not be enough funds immediately. And the response to that is, look, what you do is you give yourself a recurring fund with those assets where you generate money year by year by year. I mean, it's the parallel to us, which is, if you develop our institute here at University College Dublin, do we use up all of our capital in a one-shot deal to expand, or do we build interest on our endowment and use that? And the answer is the latter. So I think the tempting option is, which is just get the $300 billion. I think the bigger play here is you use the profits from that, but then you use other private capital and other public funds to look at, and some of those weapons would be purchased from the United States, right? And in fact, of course, when Donald Trump puts out, let's just knock this on the head, when he puts out his disinformation, when he exaggerates the level of U.S. aid and minimizes the level of aid from Europe, remember, a lot of the U.S. aid is money that went back into the U.S. system because it was American companies that got paid for those weapons, right? So I think you keep that system going, but what needs more examination is the von der Leyen proposal, which is it really feasible to get $800 billion from loosening the restrictions on state investment and on working with private capital? How quickly can you get that $800 billion? Over what time frame are we talking? And how does the money translate into, for example, weaponry? Where are we with the production cycle? Because remember, in an earlier phase of this, we were talking about artillery shells, where the EU could not deliver on the number of artillery shells it had pledged because it simply didn't have the production lines in place.
And it needs to happen ASAP because they've obviously paused the military aid, but paused that one on the way as well, as you mentioned, Scott. But I'm going to move on to some more domestic issues now because we don't have very long. So in the last few days, the Department of Government Efficiencies, they kind of announced, well, not announced, but it was reported, I guess, that they were going to cut around 70,000 jobs from the Department of Veteran Affairs. This is an agency where about 20% of the workers are actually veterans themselves. Now, this is obviously quite controversial because veteran voters usually do tend to lean a bit more right, and it's not a group of people that you want to alienate. Upsetting these veterans, how bad do you think this would be for the Republican Party?
I think it's part of what is already getting bad for the Republican Party, but you just are talking about a race against time. I mean, the soundbite is look, which will happen first? That Donald Trump and Elon Musk will completely ravage the U.S. system, with some agencies completely torn apart, like USAID, with other agencies crippled because they're told what they can and can't do, or because they've lost hundreds, thousands of personnel. Will that win, or will the reality of that destruction, the economic reality of it, the political reality of it, occur first? What you've highlighted is just one example here, and that is that not only will you be talking about veterans in the Department of Veteran Affairs who might be Trump supporters, who are affected by this, they might vote for Republican representatives and senators. And they might think, why are these guys not protecting us? But also, the offices of Veterans Affairs are not necessarily in Washington. They will be out in the states. So it will be states that will be affected because people all of a sudden are unemployed. And that's not just true for the Office of Veteran Affairs. It will be true for the Department of Defense if they carry out the purge within the Pentagon. And they're threatening to do it with civilians, not military now, but they're threatening to purge civilians there. Will it happen with the Department of Education, which all of a sudden is going to be dismantled because it's being led by the wife of Donald Trump's friend, Vince McMahon, the owner of the World Wrestling Federation? Will this happen with departments that oversee health care, for example? Even the Office of Personnel the office that oversees U.S. agencies itself, the broader agency, it itself is being gutted. You have had a series of reports coming out of town hall meetings where Republican representatives and senators are being told, wait, we voted for you and now we're the ones that are paying the price for this. And so what was the response that came out from the White House? The instruction was no more town hall meetings. Don't bring them together, right? The fact of the here is that you saw a sign of Donald Trump retreating yesterday on a slightly different front, which you actually saw two signs. I take that back. The one sign that was picked up in the press is that he retreated on tariffs again against Canada and Mexico because the stock market doesn't take kindly to it. American manufacturers don't take kindly to it. Secondly, what wasn't as widely reported, it was leaked, and it'd be interesting to know who leaked it, is that Trump had a meeting where his unelected co-president, Elon Musk, was in there with the agency heads. And the agency heads said, stop firing our people. It's our job as to who we get to hire and fire. And the story was leaked. Now, whether it pans out true, someone like said Trump supported that. Trump supported that. That would clip Musk's wings just a bit. The reality here is, in the long run, no one wins from chaos.
But Scott, I want to get into this point, right? So, yes, it did come out yesterday after all these cuts, right? It came up yesterday that Trump had reportedly told his cabinet staff that only departments, cabinet secretaries will be in charge of cutting jobs, that they still need to work with DOGE to kind of cut down spending, but actual jobs need to be job cuts need to be decided by cabinet secretaries, not Elon Musk, not his staff. Now, my interpretation was, is this the beginning of the end for the bromance between Donald Trump and Elon Musk, or did Elon Musk at least just get a slap on the wrist?
I think he got a slap on the wrist. Now, I'm going to be sitting looking at it, and I hate going onto X because it's a dumpster fire, but I'm going to be going on Elon Musk's account to see whether he acknowledges that he got the slap, and then to see how he attacks on this. And then I'm going to be watching all those cabinet secretaries, and I'm going to be watching Republican legislators that come out on this, because what you have here is we have also got the first indicators from February of how the economy's going, and it's not going well. And you have that admission from Trump and from Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, which is, tariffs is going to lead to increased prices. So the cracks are appearing. And I just want to add this because we've got a couple of commentators here in Ireland, I think in the UK, who keep saying, but the majority of Americans, they support all of these measures. Wrong. Americans are split already on whether Trump is handling the economy well. They are disapproving. A majority disapprove of what Musk is doing. But most significantly, if you want to read polls, which it is, Trump came into office around about 49% approval rating on January 20th. He's down to about 47.5 now. His disapproval rating, which was 41.5 when he started, is now up to 48. For the first time, his disapproval rating is higher than his approval rating, and he's achieved that in only 6 weeks. If you take a fundamental to kind of tie this all together and look where we go next, if you accept that Donald Trump got back into office largely because of two issues, the economy and immigration. So far, he looks good on immigration because immigration fell 75% under Joe Biden in the past year, and he can still ride that figure. But the economy, he can't ride out. A bully can punch you in the nose, but at some point, what happens when the bully gets hit by reality and gets punched back?
Just a final question for you, Scott. We've just spoken about how Americans are feeling, but I do want to get your reaction to how do you think Americans are feeling when it comes to Trump's unpredictability? Do you think that they have a lot of whiplash the same way we do as people, as bystanders?
Yeah, we do. We do, but it works in different ways. And here, there's just this long-time concept that I've been fascinated by. And there's a guy named Hale Mencken talked about it a century ago. Cynical old fellow, but he nailed it. America's a land of spectacle, right? It's a circus. And, when people get up to watch the spectacle, some of them might watch the spectacle and think, oh my God, I'm watching a disaster unfold. This is terrible. Everything is burning down. And other people might watch the spectacle and go, well, hell, I'm just going to grab the popcorn. This is kind of interesting. And then others might watch the spectacle and go, hell yeah, let it burn. You have all those strands of people that react to what is the dysfunction and the chaos in the states, because what Donald Trump has done is he's suspended the rules. He suspended the rules about how we talk to each other, which should be based on decency, tolerance, and respect. He suspended the rules in terms of the way that a government should conduct business, which should be through proper channels with proper authority. And he suspended the rules in terms of what we think is a win. We used to think of politics as a win-win game. Everybody could come out of it well. Donald Trump doesn't think of politics as win-win. He thinks of it as win-lose. Someone has to lose for him to win. And the question is, how many Americans buy into that win-lose mentality? And how many come back to the fact when they see the spectacle that unfolds each day, you know what, I'm kind of tired that some people are losing, and they might be losing very big. And here again, the race between fantasy and reality. The U.S. government is not ruled by DEI. And by the way, what's wrong with equity and inclusion? I'm just going to ask that. The U.S. is not ruled by DEI. The U.S. is not ruled by some type of woke deep state. The U.S. is actually ruled by agencies who are trying to do their jobs. And what's the reality when those agencies no longer can do those jobs effectively?
And that is a watch and wait situation, Scott, because who knows what Trump and Doge and the cabinet members will be doing with trying to, I guess, get this deficit down. It all comes back to cutting the deficit. They just want to bring debt down.
Let me give you a teaser to what to watch for. I know you've let me speak for a long time. Appreciate it, but here's the teaser. Because you want to have all this fun. Guess what happens next week? If there is no agreement on a continued resolution to fund the U.S. government, it shuts down. Bang. And the disagreement on funding the government is not a Republican versus Democrat thing. Republicans are fighting amongst themselves as to whether they increase the debt limit. In other words, whether they let Trump max out the credit cards even more. And because the Republican Party is split on that, there is no assurance that the funding resolution is going to pass before the government shuts down and everybody's services are in jeopardy, not just the ones that Elon Musk has taken the chainsaw to.
And that doesn't look good for the Trump administration at all. Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you, Maddie. It's been a pleasure.